Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon, ladies and children. Beres of Epirus here, and I am coming to you in the twilight hour. And as you can see from this meme, we're not looking at cards today. So I've been meaning to sort of do this for a bit of a while. I am quite keen on politics, and fucking hell. There's sort of a lot to talk about right now, and I thought I would share a few bits and bobs. So, to highlight what I'll sort of be discussing, I'll provide a little bit of background in regards to the United Kingdom 2019 election, and then I'll discuss the three, I would say, major, but not necessarily the most numerous parties in terms of seats held and their positions and blah blah blah, and waffle on for a bit really. So, how did we come to this? 2015, we had a general election. David Cameron, the incumbent Prime Minister, had put on the table a referendum on that is the UK's membership of the European Union, in order to placate wings of his party that were, shall we say, rebellious against the modern neoliberal globalist party that Cameron had modelled off the Blairite Labour Party. And there's no judgment in those words. I know that people on the internet will use liberal and globalism as inherently pejorative terms, but they also have political meanings which aren't necessarily inherently bad depending on your viewpoint. So if I use any nomenclature that's kind of memed or used informally by people, I'll try to highlight the political meaning of the term. So neoliberalism is in fact a conservative ideological position. Blair was in fact enamoured with Margaret Thatcher and based a lot of his policies off her actions. She was the first person that he in fact invited to Parliament upon his accession to the title of Prime Minister. And so it was only natural really that when the Conservatives shifted their position, they adopted a lot of the positions that Labour held, albeit one focused more on fiscal responsibility and austerity. This decade has very much been the crash, the bust in our sort of Keynesian economic rotisserie, and the Conservatives have handled that in the way that Conservatives often handle economic strife. They have cut public spending. They have tried to do what they term as balancing the books, and this has led to a great deal of cuts in medicine, education, social services, and regardless of your thoughts about them, this is what's happened. And so public attitudes have soured, and obviously there were lots of reasons prevented for this. And this particular wing that I came to originally, that Cameron was trying to placate, placed a lot of the blame upon the European Union. They had traditionally been against the European Union anyway for a long time. So since the 1970, I'm going to go 5 or 3 under Harold Wilson, the first EU referendum, there have always been Conservatives and other, wings of all the parties who have been suspicious of a European Union of nation states. And the 2008 crash sort of provided the perfect catalyst, this perfect storm. There was a wonderful article that indicated that the inability of the Liberal Democrats and the coalition to stem the flow of Conservative cuts also led to this weakening of the established liberal order. And effectively, what you notice in the early 2010s is this rise of, I would say, an English nationalist right within the Conservative Party. That is not a synonym with a racist party, but you need to understand the because nationalism doesn't necessitate racism, but you need to understand the context of what I'm saying. So what they wanted was a legislatively independent United Kingdom, free from what they saw were pernicious and unnecessarily bureaucratic regulations by a European body that didn't prioritize their needs first. So I appreciate I've said a lot so far, but try to stay with me. So there's this climate that the EU is a bad deal for us, and Cameron had spent actually a long time going around the European Union beforehand, actually getting quite a few concessions out of the European Union, but not getting ones in those sort of key areas, like, for example, freedom of movement. So freedom of movement in the European Union, for those who aren't familiar, is the idea that if you are a member of the European Union, you can move and work anywhere between the market. So if you are English and you want to work in Spain, you can work in Spain, and you don't need to provide a passport. There's no visa. You're not limited to living there for a certain amount of time. You can just go and do it. And actually, quite a lot of our expatriates, our expats, have retired to places like Spain and France. I imagine much to the economic detriment of those countries. In the same way that people will have come to England. And, for example, we've had an influx of, I could say an influx, that sounds a bit of a clinical term. We have filled a lot of our professional working needs with labour from Eastern Europe. Okay. And it's a system that is argued about. Economically, it works for big corporations. Economically, it works for nation states. So globalism tends to help the nation states in question on a sort of larger economic scale. It can have a negative impact on, for example, the poorer in society that are already living there, because they get outcompeted. Because people coming into their country who maybe aren't used to the standards of living that they already have and feel entitled to are willing to undercut them in terms of their working hours. And the way in which capitalism is modelled, it promotes generally, businesses getting the best deal out of their workers that they can for them, right? Not for workers necessarily. If you work in for example, like a highly competitive role that requires a lot of formal training, then they'll offer you a bigger wage because they're looking to incentivize you. But for cheap labor, there's, or should I say, for unskilled labor, you are eminently replaceable, and so there's less incentive on businesses to offer you more competitive rates. But again, that's a sort of different discussion. As you can see, this is already quite a tricksy issue, and Cameron was trying to keep his party together in the face of the rise of UKIP, which was getting a large number of votes without much success in terms of seats, because we run something called first past the post, like a two-party. Basically, it's a two-party system that doesn't work well for smaller parties in general, because you need to concentrate your voter bases within constituencies in order to get enough votes to beat your opponents. And for example, I think UKIP had like 3 million votes, but this was spread across 600 constituencies. So actually the vote share in each constituency was really low, which meant that they couldn't win any seats. So even though the vote share was high, their seat gain was negligible. Whereas under a proportional representation system, they would actually have a lot more seats, which is why you see parties like the Green Party, the Liberal Democrats, who have been campaigning for decades for proportional representation, like as far back as Charles Kennedy and earlier. He was a legend, by the way. UKIP, the Brexit Party, across all wings of the political spectrum, smaller parties in the United Kingdom have been pushing for proportional representation to the extent that there was a referendum in 2007 on the alternative vote, which failed for a number of reasons. And so the rise of UKIP, this sort of, this, I would say, right wing, extremely right wing, I would say, it is a right wing nationalist party that had elements of anti migration nationalism and elements of racist nationalism. It's not a monolith, it was a diverse, politically diverse group of people who rejected EU migration, and in some cases, in many cases, there were examples of racism. I'm not going to provide evidence now. Anyone who's British will just know this as a fact. Hashtag not all, but there's no denial that there were racist elements in the party, especially given that, for example, you had elements of the EDL and also the BNP that lent their support quite heavily to it at different points through their political livelihood, because you can argue that UKIP is in its death throes now that the Brexit Party exists, because Farage is very much the personality behind these two parties. So Cameron calls an election based on this referendum. He succeeds. Well, I say he succeeds. He establishes a minority government, and yeah. Oh god, my memory is terrible. Fairly certain that there was a minority government, because they haven't had I don't think they've had a proper government yet. Um, 300 isn't enough. I do think it was a minority. Oh wait. Oh, okay. No. Blah blah blah. Results. 330 seats. I think that might be a majority actually at the time. Outcome. Yeah, surprise victory. So 2015, working majority of 12. Ah, yes. Right, okay. Cool. So they had a majority. Not a big one. They had 12 seats, which in our system means that rebels can cause problems, as have been seen since Theresa May's election. This, by the way, is why I say that the Lib Dems aren't necessarily the largest party in terms of their seats, because the SNP hold more seats than them at present. So they held this referendum, and for a variety of different reasons, we voted to leave the European Union. Now, what's important to establish at this point in time, which is arguably one of the reasons why so many issues have arisen, is that we voted to leave, but we didn't discuss how. And this has caused a big issue over the sort of last umpteen of fucking years. So Cameron lost this referendum and decided that the honourable thing to do was to step down, which I think history will look back at and see that it was an unprecedented and unfavourable decision. I'm not sure history will judge him kindly for that. Losing a referendum Because losing a referendum does not mean that your mandate for leadership has gone. So the country still voted him in upon a mandate of the referendum and of his policies, right? Small majority, but still a working one. And actually, the expectation from the electorate would be is that he would respect which we've heard quite a lot, is that he would respect the result and work to the best of his ability to achieve that. Now, his response was that he wouldn't be able to, in all conscience, deliver that to the best of his ability. And in a way, I can understand that, because there is an element of conscience involved in terms of an MP's operations as a representative, and this is another issue that has been inflicted upon the political system for the debate for the past few years, is whether or not they are representatives or delegates. It's representatives, by the way, but hey ho. So the United Kingdom makes the decision to leave the European Union for a number of reasons that have already been gone over. The public vote, there were a variety of reasons. Some were flatly false. So, for example, Turkey joining the European Union? Absolutely not. So, there's two articles here that you can look at. I'll show you the wiki one because it's better. But there were so many membership issues that led to, I think, in 2017, Angela Merkel stating explicitly that they wouldn't be joining. And I think in 2014 and 2015, the EU had said they didn't have plans for any further accessions to the European Union for like the next 6 to 10 years. So, but just to briefly go a few of them. So there are social ones, such as religion. If you look at the Eastern Bloc in particular, there are cultural and religious reasons why a lot of them would flat out reject Turkey's access to the European Union. French as well, interestingly. You have impositions such as 2004 recognizing the Armenian genocide, which they, have not done. LGBT rights under Article 301, women's rights, conscientious objectors. So these all relate to the manner in which the political system and perhaps some of the social religious systems treat members of the state, because while they are supposedly a secular state, in practice they are operating under very particular religious expectations and rules, which don't just lead to the the persecution of others, but also of those within the religion. So, for example, Alawi Muslims and the Kurds suffer a great deal of both political and religious repression within Turkey. I think they were failing on human rights issues, judicial issues, so their laws were not treating people fairly. Economic issues, they are economically, substantial, but they weren't trading to some of the expectations of the European Union. There were diplomatic issues, all of these obstacles, and yet the ERG and the Brexit, the Vote Leave campaign used this as a catalyst to prey on, fears of people who maybe weren't equipped to fact check or were unwilling to fact check these claims. And I spent quite a lot of time combating these during the debates of the referendum with a lot of my peers. Another one, laws being made in Brussels. So again, ERG were suggesting that up to 65% of all laws is made in Brussels, which is objectively false, because that includes regulations or regulatory alignment as laws, which politically speaking isn't true. Regulations impose upon laws. They influence law. They aren't law. Laws are secondary, primary, and tertiary. And again, this article, go through, where was it? Acts of Parliament, so statutes and statutory instruments, it's about 13%, and this is, I think, 11% of primary law and about 15% of secondary law. And I can't find the original article that I did at the time of it was a proper political paper that I was using at the time, because there was a gentleman who was trying to argue with me, and his basis for believing this was an inability to do maths, which was quite unfortunate for him. So he was saying it's 25, 26%. And I was like, where's that coming from? It's like, well, it's 11 and 14. You add these two percentages together, that makes 25. And what he wasn't doing was adding the totals of those percentages as well, because they're separate figures, right? So it's 11% of 100% and 14% of 100%. So when you add the two numbers, you also add the totals, which means that he was talking about 25% of 200%, because he can't do maths. And again, it was this use of statistical analyses cleverly by by these sort of campaign bodies that led to people making decisions based on false information. Now, I've spent a bit of time sort of pissing all over a few lies. I told, like 350 million on the bus to the NHS, but I would like to highlight that there are some arguments for leaving the European Union that do make sense. For example, the impact on existing poor in a country. So, if you have a group of people who are largely unemployed, struggling to find work, and inflation of unskilled labour from other countries does impact on that. So while I have spent a bit of time talking about effectively very poor arguments to go for something, there are some arguments as to why one could have voted to leave. So anyway, so for all these reasons and these different arguments that people presented, and also some of the false information that was put out, it wasn't entirely clear why we were leaving, in terms of the different reasons presented and the personal issues that people had for leaving. But also it wasn't clear how best to do that. How best could the elected representatives do this for the public? Some wanted a hard Brexit, as it's described, which is that we just leave. We activate Article 50 and we leave without negotiating, and we just go under WTO terms. For many, that was highly improper. That was inappropriate, because we want to remain on good terms with our closest neighbours, but also because we want to remain economically stable. And for a party, the Conservative Party, that claims to value, an ideology that claims to value fiscal responsibility, that seems a little odd. You then have softer Brexits, but then how do those go about, and where do you compromise on? Do you compromise on your border integrity, for example, with Ireland? Do you compromise on your economic responsibilities? Do you allow some of the regulations within the EU to still impact on the UK as part of a trade deal, which was one of the key areas about why a lot of people politically wanted to leave the EU, because they felt the regulations challenged parliamentary sovereignty, which they don't, because it's consensual by the parliament, but we'll skip past that. Another thing that always bugs me is people go, oh, we have these unelected members in the executive of the European Union, of the European Commission. And the thing that always frustrates me about this is that, so we have an elected executive in the United Kingdom. That's our Prime Minister and the Cabinet. Okay, and the reason that they have sovereignty, they have authority, is because they're elected. And that elected nature gives them the power to dictate, right, agendas, their conscience, their mandate. The reason the EU Commission isn't elected is because if it was elected, who has true sovereignty? Why would the Prime Minister or the President of a nation state be able to refuse a directive from another elected body from the same uh, electorate? They can't. It's like with the American system, the governors, the representatives in sort of the local state-led stuff do have to back down in some extent to the higher sovereignty of the presidential decrees, right? They can fight it. They can, use legislation to and the judicial processes to sort of sidestep or countermand these things. But generally, the president has sovereign decision making. And it's the same in this case. If you allow the executive of the European Union elective authority, then they can overrule prime ministers and presidents, and that's when sovereignty is removed. The whole exercise, even though it's been dragged out, is testament to how we have sovereignty. Because we can leave. We're not bound to do anything that they tell us to do. We choose to. But hey-o, that's sort of a different meeting. Right. Hopefully there's a bit of background there. So this election is the culmination of two failed terms of Conservative government after the referendum under Theresa May and Boris Johnson, where they have not succeeded in negotiating a deal to leave the European Union. Now, some of you will turn around to me and say, but Boris did succeed in creating a deal, and you're absolutely right, he did. The reason for calling this election was because Parliament refused to spend 3 days critically evaluating something like 1,000-page document, which would normally be allocated between 2 and 6 weeks to look over, depending on the urgency of the issue. He took that as casus belli to call for an election which the other parties, having secured the extension, then agreed to. So this election is very much called by the Conservative, by Boris Johnson, in almost a mirror image of Theresa May's attempt to establish a working majority. Do we think that's going to happen? The past few elections would indicate no. This country is as divided in terms of political parties as it is on Brexit. So I thought I would go through their manifestos. I appreciate we're 28 minutes in. Bear with me. I appreciate we're 28 minutes in already. But now that I provide a little bit of background, and perhaps you've gleaned a little insight into where my political opinions lie, my biases, we can move on to these. So let's get started. The Conservative Party manifesto. So what are they talking about? Let's investigate. So on health, 50,000 more nurses, no long-term aims or delivery, and also they'll be full-time. So reports seem to indicate that this includes some existing ones who will be encouraged to remain or attracted to rejoin after leaving. Now I imagine that this refers to ones that perhaps would lose visa or right to work. There we go. So the party claims this will cost 879 million. It's devolved, so we're only directly responsible for it in England, although while it says that, we do allocate budget for Scotland and Wales, so sort of. It's not the total cost of eventually having 50,000 more nurses. Like, that's not even close. So, blah, 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 blah. So how far would 50,000 nurses? So so what would the impact be? So we would be returning to about 2010 levels, a little bit higher, which I guess isn't terrible, but if you think about it, that's not necessarily the most significant of increases. We're looking at perhaps one extra person per 1,000 people, you know. Brexit. So, love this phrase, get Brexit done, it's oven ready. Jesus Christ. So, yeah, if he's elected back in, he ought to have a mandate to pass his deal, and then we can start on to the next stage of transition for leaving the European Union. But the notion that it will get Brexit done is not true, because it's not going to be completed in January, because we haven't secured a trade deal. So, you know, hey ho. So the Conservatives have claim they're going to put 20,000 more officers on the streets. And again, what I think is really interesting here, this would return the number of police officers. So a lot of the claims by the Conservative manifesto here is to return us to a pre-austerity state, okay? Which is why it's always a frustration when they talk about, you know, highest ever or most ever, because what they're talking about is just in terms of physical money spent, not in terms of what we would term real terms. So, for example, I work in education, and we receive more money than ever, but in real terms, we receive the same. So, since 2010 now, schools receive in real terms the same amount that they did in 2010. So, my first school, for example, they got, I think, 12 million in 2010, and they were receiving, with inflation, the equivalent of that today. So even though they were receiving the same money, costs have increased, wages have increased, inflation has impacted. So per pupil, actually, we have less to spend. So it's an interesting thing about figures that you just need to bear in mind. When they talk about, you know, we're spending more, well, yes, of course you are, because of inflation, but you're not in real terms spending more. And this is particularly important for the NHS. They're spending the most ever on the NHS, but in real terms, they're actually spending, I think, a little bit less, if you remind, or at least they were in the 2017 election. Now they might have promised to do a bit more. So, yeah, between 2010 and 2019, we've lost 20,000 police. They would like to put 20,000 back on. So, you know, and again, population increases means that even though they're looking to return us, it would actually leave, you know, a 5% sort of difference in terms of how it would look. So that's sort of manifesto-wise. In terms of their debates so far and their media campaign for the election, they've really, I think they've had a tough time. I'm not sure if this is part of a greater strategy or not, but they're hitting wall after wall after wall. So they had this. So they cut out a bit of this interview.
Why would the EU give you a good deal if they know that you're going to actively campaign against it?
So this pause here. Here's the original answer.
Why would the EU give you a good deal if they know that you're going to actively campaign against it? Well, which is clearly what most of you are going to be doing.
Well, Piers, I have been talking to the EU, to political leaders across the EU 27 countries for 3 years. and I know very well what the parameters are of any deal.
Now, the really interesting thing about that was that Piers Morgan called them out because he was surprised they'd done this at all. Because actually, the argument that Keir Starmer gives isn't fantastic in of itself, right? They could have just used Keir Starmer's position to try and, show Labour for not being particularly with it. But instead, they doctored it. They made it look as if Keir Starmer hadn't. So this was the first one. Then you have during the PM debate, change his name to Fact Checker. Hopefully this will load. So, yeah. So, during the the prime ministerial debates on the BBC. So they had, I think it was the BBC. No, it was the ITV one with Corbyn and Johnson. Their Twitter handle changed their name to Fact Check UK. So they pretended to be an impartial fact-checking body about the debate in the hope that they could encourage people looking to check up on policies that Labour were putting out there. They could spin the way that people interpreted it, which is hugely disingenuous, and the way in which they've responded to it has been fairly appalling as well. Dominic Raab effectively responded to this to "Who gives a toss?" and actually, quite a few people, quite a few people give a toss about this. You then had, and then you've just had Boris Johnson going up to South Yorkshire and being rebutted quite politely, but quite firmly. So Yorkshire and Derbyshire's had flooding. It took him a week to go up and visit people who were there, and they were largely unimpressed by that. Boris Johnson hasn't been debating particularly well. I mean, he's not as robust he's not as exercised in that sort of public forum as perhaps Jeremy Corbyn is. So they've had a very difficult start. What's really surprising is that despite all of this, they're still ahead in the polls. And actually, a lot of the policies they seem to be putting out are hitting the right places. People want more police. People want investment in the NHS. They are, ironically, moving towards sort of social Christian conservatism, which is what Theresa May was. And they are presenting a deal very similar to Theresa May's, and they're polling pretty well because of the person in charge. So, that's the Conservatives. We've got Labour. So these these are not costed. Like, they are just giving. I mean, this is the classic example of a second party not expecting to win, promising the world to get as many votes as they can. So 5% pay rise, free hospital parking. They're going to buy broadband. We're going to have free broadband. Nationalise the railways. They're going to only tax the top 5%, which was quite expertly challenged by Andrew Marr on Sunday, because they're looking to get rid of the married couples allowance. So they'd be charging £250 extra a person who's married from any background, which means technically they are increasing taxes for people under 80,000. So Labour have a lot of, I think, popular ones, but what is kind of getting people a bit suspicious about it is that there doesn't seem to be any idea how to pay for it. So free dental, hospital parking, tuition fees are going to get scrapped, broadband, 5% pay rise for public sector. We do need one. 11 billion windfall tax on oil giants, hiking tax on corporations, people earn over 80k. they are doing stuff on climate change, not quite the same at the conference, but there is an element of freedom of movement. They are going for a referendum, a people's vote. Well, they're going to negotiate a new deal and then put it to the people. I'm not sure. I'm fairly certain Theresa May said she could negotiate a new deal in 3 months. Or was that Dominic Raab when he was working for Theresa May? Fucking prick. But yeah, Labour think they can do it now, which is an interesting thing. Income tax hikes. No increase in VAT or national insurance. Corporation tax will be hiked. Now, there's some really interesting things about that. People talk about how corporation tax would make us lose business, but we're one of the lowest corporation taxes in Europe, so I don't know about that. Yeah, loads of stuff. Second home tax, scrapping married persons, forcing private school fees to be subject to VAT. I mean, that makes sense anyway, because they're not fucking charities. So NHS, free prescriptions, annual dental, free hospital parking, 26 billion funding boost. That, doesn't seem like enough, but okay. Infrastructure plan, 1 million trees. Okay. Stands on NHS food. So care contractors barred from tax avoidance. 50-minute care visits ended. Increase of carers allowance. So education, free school meals, all of them, really? Okay. I'll be honest. I've got a boy. He's not going to have school meals. I'm going to give him pat lunches. So I don't care if they're free. School meals are not good enough, in my opinion, for children. So I think the discussion should be, and this is more of a personal nuanced view, but it should be less about them being free and just about increasing the quality of them. Scrapping tuition fees, although I won't lose my existing student debt. Bricks. Free childcare. Yay! That's quite important, actually. Although Lib Dems have sort of led the way on this. It is quite difficult, even for working parents, to secure this. I had a colleague who had to basically quit teaching because it was cheaper for her to not work and look after her child than to work and pay for childcare. Scrapping Ofsted, yay! Maximum class size of 30. Okay, good luck with that. So yeah, loads of stuff. We'll go to Brexit. Second referendum, customs union, scrapping the 2014 Immigration Act. So obviously that'll be a big issue for a lot of people who voted on a sort of anti-immigration basis. Transformation Fund for the North. Heard that before, haven't we? Their spending's off the wall. Nationalised rail, water and energy. 4-day week. Yeah. So Labour's big problem is how the fuck are they going to pay for it? So moving on to Liberal Democrats. So stop Brexit. Sweet. Brexit's a pile of shit. The amount of shit that it's caused over the last few years has been insane. I really tried at the beginning of the sort of referendum results to be congenial and reasonable, but quite frankly, I'm just done. I've lost patience, and people who voted to leave will have lost patience and will be like, let's just get out. Well, I've gone the other way. I voted Remain. I've lost patience. Just fucking stop it. Shouldn't have done it in the first place. Referendums aren't legally binding. MPs aren't delegates, they're representatives. They have every right to vote within their conscience. And if they don't think that's the best thing for you, then vote someone else. You fucking prick. Anyway, moving on, because that's me getting way too emotional about that. This has been talked about for fucking years, and every time we don't get it. I think it's true. I think it's a good thing to do. By the way, I'm probably not voting Lib Dem. Well, unless they're the second party in my constituency, so I'm in a Conservative constituency, so I'll be voting for the second party to reduce their majority, because the lower majority, the harder they have to work for you. You never know. Second party might take it. Ooh, excitement. Swing state. Yeah, penny income tax rise for the NHS. Saucy. Free childcare. So they've gone even further. You know, I think this is fair enough. If governments and businesses expect working parents to work, both of them, if they want to push, for example, the notion that men and women should both have careers and should both be working, then their childcare should be goddamn free. You cannot have it both ways. You can't say that it's sexist to force women to stay at home and then make it unaffordable for them to do anything else, right? Like, it doesn't make sense. It also benefits the poorer in society, which is generally a good thing, you know. 80% of electricity from renewables, yeah, needs to happen. I really want a party just to, go big and go brave and up the amount of nuclear we have. It's just the right thing to do. It is carbon neutral, so I'll fight you on that one. Tax frequent flyers. This was an interesting one. They got a bit of flack for this. I think it's reasonable. Frequent flyers tend to be higher paid corporate bodies. They can afford to do it. Whether that will have a negative impact on ticket costs in general is another question. That could be a clusterfuck, because airlines already charge an extortionate amount for their flights. But there you go. 20,000 more teachers. Good luck with that. Recruitment will only happen when standards improve. Like improve teaching standards. Like, don't drown us in marking and bureaucracy and admin. Give us better means with which to deal with behaviour, like smaller classrooms as an example. Offer us more emotional and mental health support. Then we can talk about recruiting more teachers. There's a reason that overwhelmingly it is newer teachers that quit, because the environment they place people in is not acceptable. That's an interesting one. Fair enough. Freeze train fares. This has already been done, isn't it? I mean, to be fair, with some of the train companies, we should fucking burn them alive for not hitting standards and charging, up to $5,000 a year for a season ticket, which then the onus is on you to claim it back when they fail. It's retarded. 20% rise. I mean, okay, you do that because you're never going to get into power. Resettlement. That will be very controversial with a lot of people. I'm not personally against it. It's refugees. They're different from immigrants. But some people don't like them. That's not necessarily something that's going to win them votes, but it is a moral policy. Which again, they can do because they're not expecting to win. Tougher borrowing rules. Interested. 300,000 new homes a year. Well, let's hope that they make them affordable, and I mean genuinely affordable, because the Conservatives have built something like 250,000 homes in the last 4 years, and not a one hits the standards of being an affordable home. So, yeah, Look at that. So that's my take on it. I know I've rambled, but fucking hell. Best thing to do if you are thinking about participating, which I would recommend that you do your research. You know, not just on one website, not just on one newspaper. Look at different fact checkers, look at different newspapers, watch different MPs talking from all political parties, get as unbiased and informed a view as you possibly can. Look into your local candidates, you know, and look into them. They matter too. It's not just about voting party or single issue, even though our system encourages that. Look at it. Anyway, I hope this has been of some use to some of you. It's so fucking fragmented, I can't even imagine. But yeah, there you go. Politics video. Ta-ta.